Welcome to the Fix List, a guide to improving your paintings by looking at other work in search of common visual problems. Today's problem is depth. In short, it's tricking the audience into thinking they're looking at a dimensional space, even though really they're looking at a flat computer monitor. We've got a number of different ways to solve this problem, and to help us out, we're going to use some work from the ctrl+paint community. The first one we're looking at here is a scene that really has an opportunity for a lot of depth. We have a character who's very small, looking at a sweeping landscape that's very big. The problem is we have a lot of these horizontal lines, sort of bands of middle ground, but we don't really have a good sense of things that are big in the foreground and things that are tiny in the background. So the strategy I'm going to use to improve this one is overlapping shapes. Overlapping shapes is a great way to prove that something is in front of something else. As a first step, I'm going to establish linear perspective. I don't want to talk too much about it in this video. We'll save it for another one, but know that linear perspective makes overlapping much easier. So I'll hide the grid for a second, and I'll show you the final result. It's messy, I agree, but what we have here are forms overlapping each other. Once again, here's before. Look how small the character is in the foreground, and they're overlapping the bank a little bit, but they're not overlapping enough different planes to really give a sense of them being close to the viewer. So what I've done is enlarged them and pulled them back, and in the process, they overlap the middle ground and they overlap the background. I also did a bit of repetition, so you can see here to prove exactly how big this column is. I made 3 of them, and as they move towards the background, you can see they follow this perspective and diminish in scale. But they are overlapped by trees, and they themselves overlap the background trees. So we have planes overlapping planes. And even though my paint over is very messy, hopefully you can see the difference, where we have before, very little overlap, and then after, much more overlap. With this image here, my goal is to do both overlap and also a little bit of atmospheric perspective. Now, this is a little different from linear perspective because all it does is change colors. We can see first I set up a perspective grid, and that just kind of gives guidance to the new elements that I add to the frame. I'll hide that for a minute. So we can see here I still have overlapping. We have repeating shapes that diminish in scale, just like the previous image. And there are overlapping clouds to separate the planes from one another. And what I've also done is atmospheric perspective. So here I have allowed the colors in the background to kind of absorb more of the sky color. We have higher contrast in the foreground, more of sort of the local color of the objects. And then as we recede into the distance, things wash out a bit. They receive more of the atmosphere color and less of the local color. This is a great way to enhance the sense of depth. Anytime you can see really far into the distance, there's a good chance that you're seeing a lot of atmosphere and there's lower contrast in the background. So one more time, here's before and here's after. Overlapping and atmospheric perspective. What we see here actually meets the criteria that I said in a lot of the other ones. We have nice overlap. We have a good amount of atmosphere in the background. It goes from high contrast to lower contrast as we recede in space. That's all good. The problem, though, is a lack of color differentiation. It's all green. What I've done with my paint over is to add a blue cast to the middle ground and then almost completely monochrome or gray in the background. So we transition between warm greens in the foreground into blue, into gray. And in doing so, without changing anything else in the image, it really enhances that sense of depth. Here's before, here's after. This image has a really interesting composition. I like a lot about it, including overlaps and repeated forms, things we mentioned earlier on. But what this one lacks are value separations. So let me show you what my final result looks like. What I've done here is not specifically atmospheric perspective. It's more a case of just tweaking the values in order to artificially separate shapes from other shapes. Before, we have kind of uniform mountains everywhere. It's all essentially one value. We can see the sky, we can see the hand, and then rocks. What I've done here is separated chunks of rocks from other chunks by either making the ones next to them lighter or darker. And in doing so, I have sort of a value puzzle. The hand is its own set of values. Foreground its own set of values. As a result, even were I to shrink this way down, you can still see different elements of the image much more clearly. And I'll even leave it small when you do before and after. So here's before, and here's after. Before, after. So there's no particular name for this, but just controlling the areas of value to have shapes separate from each other is a great way to enhance depth. Here's a painting I made. This is a couple years old at this point, and I like it a lot, but what I did not really think about was depth. This image feels very flat. It's pretty much just middle ground. To change that fact, I first added a perspective grid, and then I essentially expanded the scene. But the process I used was strong linear perspective and repeated forms that get smaller and smaller as they recede from you. We're essentially using these repeating arch elements to explain exactly how much space is receding until we get to this focal point here. So again, I'm not sure if I love the results, but it does have more depth than the original. So here's the original, and here's the new one. So whether you're talking about shape overlap or atmospheric perspective or value separation, making sure there is a sense of depth in any illustration can really help it out. And I want to thank the brave audience members that sent in their art to help with this project. It's not easy to get your work critiqued, so thanks for the help. See you in the next video.